Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session. It is a real pleasure to have you join us for today session on Natural Capital Valuation Hub dialogue series. The Natural Capital Hub is an initiative dedicated to advancing the understanding and application of natural capital valuation in decision making. Uh, our mission is to help bridge the gap between ecological systems and economic and financial systems by fostering dialogue, developing practical approaches, and connecting experts across disciplines. Through this series, we explore how nature can be more effectively recognized, measured, and integrated into financial reporting policy and investment decisions. And today's session is titled Nature Outcome Agreement Areas, Linking Conservation, Financial Reporting, and Financing. This is a timely and important discussion as organization and government increasingly look for credible ways to align natural capital with financial accountability, reporting frameworks, and capital allocation. And today we are very fortunate to be joined by two amazing and outstanding speakers. First, one of our industry partner and thought leader and really one of the pillar of natural capital hub valuation community of practice, Mr. Bailey Church, who leads the KPMG Canada National Public Sector Accounting Advisory Service line and is the leader of the Public Sector ESG Center of Expertise. Bailey also leads KPMG Global International Public Sector Accounting Standards Working Group and serves on Canada's Sustainability Assurance Committee under the Auditing and Assurance Standard Board. Bailey brings extensive experience working with over 300 governments on sustainability and biodiversity reporting. He has advised municipalities across Canada on ESG strategies, natural asset management and measurement and valuation, and plays a leading role in advancing disclosure frameworks aligned with the TNFD. He is also board member of Natural Asset Initiative and is actively involved in multi-stakeholder collaborations, shaping the future of natural asset reporting and valuation. It's an opportunity also to thank Mr. Bailey and KPMG Canada for their long-lasting support of our natural capital valuation hub. We are also joined by Dr. Daniel Kraus, a transdisciplinary conservation scientist working at the intersection of science, policy, and practice. With more than 30 years of experience advancing biodiversity conservation across Canada. Dr. Kraus has held senior role with Nature Conservancy of Canada and currently teaches at the University of Waterloo and serves on Canada Nature Advisory Committee. It is an opportunity also to thank the University of Waterloo for being one of the partner for our SHIRK Partnership Research Grant. Daniel's work focuses on developing innovative and transformative approaches to conservation in collaboration with governments, First Nations, foundations, industries, and NGOs. His research spans on natural capital, conservation policy, ecological connectivity, and Canada's priority ecoregions. And he's a frequent contributor to national policy discussions and public discourse. He's also a strong advocate for accessible science with his work, and his work is widely featured in national media. Together, Mr. Church and Mr. Kraus will help us explore how nature outcome agreement area can serve as a bridge between conservation goals and financial systems, and what this means for practitioners, policymakers, and investors. With that, I'll turn it over to Bailey to help us get started. Bailey, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Samir, and a big thanks to the Natural Capital Hub for hosting Daniel and I today for this conversation. And thank you for the great leadership and amazing work that you all are doing. KPMG is very proud to be a partner and to support that great work. Look, I think the fact we're having this conversation today is a fantastic sign of just how far we have come. And when we look at natural assets and nature finance overall, we're at such a pivot point in this country. We have global ambitions in terms of what we want to achieve in terms of our 30 by 30 goals, our Canada Nature 30 strategy. We have very large ambitions, but we don't have the enabling infrastructure to achieve it today. We need a fundamental rethink of the DNA of our economic systems in terms of how we approach natural assets, nature finance, if we're going to achieve the large scale systematic outcomes that we want to as a country. And I would say that we need to achieve as a country for our growth and our prosperity. If we look at how we have traditionally treated natural assets and approached nature finance, natural assets, as we know, are not reflected on any government financial statements today. And we've evolved there out of very well-intentioned principles of conservatism in accounting and what we recognize on government balance sheets, on private sector entity balance sheets, and have traditionally looked at these assets as effectively a free commodity. We've looked at natural assets and said we don't have enough control over measurable future economic benefits. We can't reliably quantify the valuation of these assets in a way that, as accountants, as auditors, we can wrap our minds around and get comfortable with. And with all of this, these have not been reflected in our financial reporting, but the correlation of that lack of recognition is, of course, they're not being factored into our decision making, and we're not assigning a value to natural assets that reflect and impact our decisions, our asset management planning, and ultimately how we view and create wealth in this country. We also need to think differently about how we finance conservation and natural assets, and moving away from these models of project by project subsidies to a much more balance sheet driven capital strategy. And this is where nature outcome agreement areas and the great work of Daniel and the University of Waterloo and Environment and Climate Change Canada come into play. So I'm really excited we're going to hear more about that. because right now we've got, for the first time in generations, we have accounting rules that now open the door to recognition. We have a standard issued by the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board that opens the door for governments to recognize natural assets that they are preserving for conservation, and where they can demonstrate they have control over the future economic benefit from those natural assets. This is a fundamental rethink in terms of how governments around the world approach natural assets. Before, you could effectively say nature was worth more dead than alive from an accounting perspective. We recognize no value unless we were extracting our natural resources from the ground, harvesting nature to generate value. And now what we're recognizing is really what the rest of the world has seen in Canada for so long, that our value lies in these conserved natural assets, in these vast array of lands that we protect and conserve. They recognize this value in our north. They recognize this value in our waters, our oceans, our lakes, and our rivers. And again, we see the value that these have to the rest of the world. Why don't we have and recognize this on our financial statements? So we have an accounting standard now that enables this. And what we now need to do is to connect and to link that accounting opportunity with how we collectively manage and preserve and conserve our natural assets across the country. And we need to do that with a lens towards wealth creation, value creation, in a way that will enable us to attract and create investable outcomes. And certainly there are a lot of different mechanisms that are used today to enable investments in nature, but they're not on the scale that Canada needs to fully realize the benefits. That they're not on the scale that Canada needs to attract large private equity funds, large pension funds, to invest and support conservation. The reason I personally believe we haven't done this is because we've always come at this conversation from two different angles. We look at this from an accounting and a finance lens in terms of how do we go about extracting measurable value that we can realize. On the nature side, we look at it in terms of how do we protect our biodiversity, our natural assets, and we have in effect the stakeholders talk different languages. The goal of this dialogue, the goal of Daniel's important work on nature outcome agreement areas, is to translate those two languages and to get us on the same page in terms of how we can both recognize nature and create these investable outcomes that will attract capital. Ultimately, when we can create capital market systems that people see that they have reliable, investable outcomes that they can trust, that they can verify, and where they see that they can realize opportunities, that will encourage investors to come to Canada to invest in our nature outcome areas, invest in our biodiversity, and ultimately create wealth for all Canadians. And this is where I get so excited, Daniel, for the important work that you're doing and all the opportunities that creates. I'm going to pause and pass it over to you to take us through those findings.
Thank you
Just
so
before
much.
we hand it over to Dan, I want to remind everybody that could not join us through the hyperlink. They can watch this through YouTube or through LinkedIn, and they can post their question, and we'll make sure that their question will be handled by Mr. Bailey and Mr. Daniel. Dan, is over to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Bailey, for that setup. I always learn something new every time I hear you speak, which I really appreciate. And thank you for this opportunity today. 30 years ago when I started my career, I never thought I'd be talking to economists and accountants to help solve the world's biodiversity problems. If anything, kind of saw the economic system as a threat to biodiversity. And, certainly sometimes that separation between nature and economy has caused issues in terms of environmental degradation and species extinction. But I think that we're finding sort of that separation of nature and economy is not working well for our natural world, and it's certainly not working well for people. And I sometimes remind myself that, economy and ecology, they have the same root word, which is, Greek for looking after the house. And I think that if we can look after the house together, we're going to have better returns for biodiversity and for our own well-being. So this project initiated just recognizing the complex problem that we face and the ambitions that we have from many different directions. From a conservation of biodiversity perspective, we know that we need to bend the curve on biodiversity loss. We have ambitious commitments through Canada's nature strategy, which is part of the global biodiversity framework, to protect 30% of our lands and waters by 2030, to stop the extinction of species, and to do so in a way that respects Indigenous sovereignty and supports their society and stewardship and integration with the natural world. At the same time, Canada has many ambitious commitments as well around economic development. I don't think I can watch TV without seeing a Build Ontario ad for something new that's going to be created in the province. And we certainly have critical minerals and projects of national interest and an interest in moving these quickly. So how can we move these important national projects forward quickly? How can we move conservation forward more quickly? We looked at approaches that seem to be working across the country. So with these bright spots where there seems to be this integration of economy and ecology and people, and things seem to be going forward in a different way. So not the conservation that we used to do, but the conservation that maybe we need to do for the future. And there are examples of things where we're looking more at not just drawing lines on map and saying nature here, development here, but things that are more based on thresholds. We want to maintain a certain amount of habitat or a certain population of a species. And we're seeing land use planning that's not so much focused on getting all of the lines on the map right away and putting a stamp on it, but building relationships around a land base and identifying what are sort of the common outcomes that everyone can agree upon. And many of these are being led by Indigenous communities. And in many ways, I think Indigenous perspectives are much better at incorporating uncertainty into planning, at understanding complex problems, and building relationships as opposed to a plan that's based on compromise. So after reviewing all of the things that seem to be kind of working in some of the future directions, we developed this essentially a planning concept called nature outcome agreement areas. It brings in some of the best examples that we're seeing, including things around thresholds, including things around relationship and collaborative land use planning that's more iterative in nature and is long-term. So we've identified a nature outcome agreement is something it's an iterative and it's a shared framework for decision-making and accountability and collaboration. It has to be within a geographically delineated space. And it's where there's multi-sector participation. It's led by Indigenous people, but there's also local communities, governments, resource sectors. And there's that commitment or agreement towards shared and measurable conservation outcomes. These places should be cooperatively governed through long-term relationships and open dialogue, and supported by a very transparent and rigorous monitoring programs that ensures that the outcomes, the common ground that everyone's agreed upon are exceeded or met. So if you can kind of picture, right now we've kind of thought of these areas primarily in Canada's north. So if you can picture like a large 10,000 square kilometer area of intact habitat. Canada is one of the few countries left in the world that has these large, high integrity ecosystems where Indigenous people have lived since time began. It may be an area where we know there's going to be some mining, but there's also important biodiversity outcomes. Could we agree that a certain level of development would be allowed? Say 10% of the area could be developed, but without drawing lines on a map. And as development is phased in, it sort of brings that threshold down in terms of what can be allowed within that area. NOAAs do require dialogue. They do require some kind of a legal framework, and those are things that we are working on. But for governments, we see it as an opportunity to accelerate conservation, maybe to reduce conflict. It has parties and groups meet around common ground as opposed to maybe a project that divides. For industry, can provide some certainty, provide relationship building, perhaps streamline approvals. For Indigenous people on the lands, it's a promise of co-governance and leadership, providing long. And for finance, for what we're here today, can it provide a pipeline of investable outcomes where investors know that 80, 90, whatever percent of a certain habitat feature, be it forests or peatlands, will be maintained in the long term. Again, not knowing exactly where they will be, but knowing within this landscape that will be maintained. So we're still working on this concept. We're talking to different groups, industry, Indigenous, folks involved in protected and conserved areas, and certainly trying to understand how it can be financed in parallel with the governance and some of the structural mechanisms that we'll need to implement these.
Daniel, can I just add a few comments? Because where I get so excited with this is when I think traditionally of how we've approached conservation, we've looked at it as a win-lose in terms of economic development, and it's either a scenario where we are developing an area and we've got mining operations, infrastructure being built, or something being done in that area, or we are preserving it and we're not doing any activity there. And when we look at the current economic climate and Canada's broad approach for nation building, I think that win-lose argument is not one that's helping either side. Well, we with the nature outcome agreement areas have a way to both conserve but also create and reward some focused economic development. And I think that's where this gets really exciting. And I know when you and I talked, we also talked about how one could broaden out the concept of a blended investor return for both elements of the economic development, but also elements of the conservation. So you're only maximizing your return when both sides win.
Yeah, I love that, Bailey. And I think in the past, you're right, conservation or development, it's been a zero-sum game. And I think that if we can integrate a little bit more, I've certainly found with this project, talking to a diversity of folks who I don't normally talk to in my conservation world, it actually seems that the gap that we have between conservation and sustainable development is not as wide as we sometimes make it out to. And that, most conservation organizations, certainly many Indigenous communities, local communities, they want to see nature protected. They want to see the contributions that nature provides to our society and our well-being protected, but they also don't want to close the door on any development. And I think that if we see conservation as something that's going to close opportunities, we're going to run into barriers. I still remember when Ontario brought in the Far North Act like 20 years ago, which was this promise that 50% of Ontario's boreal forest was going to be protected. And sort of having like my previous conservation hat on, that seemed like a great idea. Let's just kind of draw those lines on the map and protect those areas. But that never happened. And it never happened because there were communities that were concerned about future economic opportunities being limited if there were regulated, protected areas. Industry was concerned based on known resources, but also recognizing that minerals that weren't valuable 20 years ago could have a higher economic value. And governments, didn't want to see some of these areas sort of like locked up either. So part of it is, can we develop a framework that allows for that, recognizing that we can still keep most of the nature and nature's benefits intact on the landscape, but not drawing those lines right away. That seems to be the barrier that we hit in terms of finding ourselves at that zero-sum game where someone feels like they're winning and someone feels that they're losing.
And I was also really happy to hear the reference to the pipeline of investable opportunities, and that's what really gets an accounting person like myself quite excited. I think that is a big distinction with where we're looking to move in terms of both nature outcome agreement areas, in terms of Canada's Nature 30 strategy, and if we're ultimately going to attract capital at the scale we need to, because we know biodiversity conservation is so dramatically underfunded at the moment. I mean, we need to increase it by about 5 times to do anywhere near what we need to do to meet our nature goals. If we're going to do that, we've got to attract substantial investment in capital. And the only way we bring those players to the table is if they see that investable pipeline there, not the one-off projects that are based on a win-lose outcome, but that larger stream of projects that rewards both. I think that's also where this gets really, really exciting.
Yeah, I think getting the 30%, if we make it by 2030, that's to be seen. But the one thing for sure, it takes a long time to establish protected and conserved areas. And I think the one thing through a NOAA approach is that we can have an agreement over what will be conserved over large landscapes within Canada. And maybe that's what can bring the investment to scale and invest and attract some of the investors that you were mentioning earlier that want big, ambitious, world-changing projects to invest in.
It also really creates a great opportunity, and I think it emphasizes why our Indigenous stakeholders need to be such a key part of this conversation too, given the vast lands and areas that are subject to conservation. I see that them also as so vital to the success of nature outcome agreement areas and ultimately our Nature 30 strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see that as central to the delivery of nature outcome agreement areas, both the governance and the leadership by Indigenous communities on the ground, but also using that conservation finance to support things like guardian programs, to support Indigenous-led monitoring that can directly measure progress towards the thresholds that have been agreed upon.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'll just add, I think the whole concept of nature outcome agreement areas and relationships, working together, I mean, really does have its roots in, I think, more Indigenous approaches to conservation and worldviews.
No, very, very well said. It's interesting if you think of an analogy to how we traditionally invested in infrastructure. And I know you and I had this conversation a while ago, Dan, but if you think about investing in traditional physical infrastructure like a bridge, an airport, where we often use vehicles like public-private partnerships and have government and private sector working together towards certain outcomes, we always had this premise of both a known commodity where with certainty that you're investing in this particular infrastructure project. You can trust the underlying data reporting systems and outcome measurement. You have a level of verifiability around that underlying information that gives investors the confidence to come to the party. And we need to have that level of confidence and have the guardrails in place that make investment safe. And I think now with nature outcome agreement areas, we've got that opportunity to effectively enable that same system for investing in natural capital and natural assets. And that to me is transformative for.
Yeah. I hope that it is an opportunity and a framework that can reduce like the risk and uncertainty for both investors and for regulators. And that in itself, I think, is a way to maybe get people to the table and hopefully start to pilot some of these nature outcome agreement areas and just see what are the conditions that are needed to have something that is kind of long-term, and that we have some kind of like some type of legal framework or policy framework that does provide that certainty for investors.
The governance and oversight is going to be so important, and making sure stakeholders, whether it's our Indigenous communities, other nature advocates, communities, all have to have a appropriate and balanced voice in the conversation. And I think the governance side is one where we're going to collectively need a lot of work to make it a safe and a safe and productive format for everybody.
Yeah, and as I said, we're still kind of developing ideas and concepts, but I think one sort of key pillar is that it should be flexible and adaptable to kind of local policy needs, but also needs of the local community. So in some cases, a nature outcome agreement area, the enforcement may be through a legal agreement. In other cases, it may be through some kind of policy or regulation or land use planning policy within a province or a territory. So I think we want to kind of build in that flexibility, but need to make sure that there is that certainty of long-term protection for those outcomes that everyone has agreed upon.
Absolutely. I think there's it's such enormous opportunity, and ultimately, if we're going to achieve Canada's nature 2030 goals, we absolutely have to have all these stakeholders working together. We have to attract investors. Government, in my mind, if we're strictly relying on government funding and development, we'll never even get 10% of the way there. We really need private equity and investors at the table.
Yeah. And, that was certainly reflected in the recent Canada Nature strategy as, investment being one of the central pillars. And, honestly, I see that as something it's the money is really important. What may be just as important and just as transformational is like all of the new partners that suddenly brings to the table. And I think there is this growing recognition that nature and nature conservation, it's too important to be a government responsibility, and to be truly effective, it needs to be a all of society approach. And that's why, I get more excited talking to you than my conservation science colleagues, because this is transformational in terms of how we can solve some of the problems related to the loss of biodiversity.
I'm beaming with excitement here. I think there's so much great work to be done, and I'm excited to see where this goes. Samir, I saw a number of questions come in.
There is a lot of questions. We're going to start with my colleagues and co-director of the Natural Capital Valuation Hub. My question is, do you see any potential roadblocks that should be taken into account as a roadmap is being developed to sustain momentum and keep the initiative moving forward?
There's lots we got to work through. Yeah. Dan, do you want to go first?
Well, just like a specific one related to the mining sector is if you have mining claims across huge areas that have been established by a diversity of prospectors or junior companies, how can you bring all of them to the table? And would there even be sort of speculation in terms of staking if there's knowledge that an outcome agreement area might be established here, and maybe there's a need to buy out some of the mining claims. However, what I'm hearing from our mining sector partners is that sure, Canada has like wall-to-wall mining claims, but very few of those are ever going to be developed. And I'm hearing numbers like 5% or something. So it may be that that's not a roadblock, but it is something that we do need to figure out. And then the other one is figuring out the governance structures and what seems to work to provide that certainty that there will be long-term conservation.
Yeah. If you think about Canada coast to coast, there are very, very few nature outcome areas, very, very, very few conservation areas that are strictly within the jurisdiction of one level of government. We need to have federal government, provincial and territorial governments, First Nations, municipalities, as well as private sector and others, all at the table working together to achieve the full benefit of this. So that stakeholder management piece is absolutely critical. But I'd also say, if I put on my accounting hat, the underlying data and the verifiability is also going to be key from an investor lens to create that confidence in measurable outcomes and results. So we really need to bring that practice forward. And right now, I think a lot of the methodologies that are out there from a valuations perspective aren't necessarily aligned with accounting frameworks. In getting those compatible, getting to that measurability and data side is essential.
Next question. This is from Dr. Amna Shalwati, co-director of the Natural Capital Valuation Hub. I understand that conservation typically requires long-term commitment, often spanning decades, whereas financial reporting focuses on quarterly or annual cycle. How can these differing timescale be better aligned?
Bailey, do you want me to start with the conservation?
Yeah, sure.
Of that? Absolutely long-term commitment. Forever in many cases is really the goal. But certainly for an area to be recognized as protected or conserved, that long-term commitment is part of the criteria that Canada has established. Now, what long-term means is sort of, up for debate, but some certainty that decades an area would be protected. I think what sets the nature outcome agreement approach makes it a little bit different is that we'll have these areas where there's a guarantee a certain amount of habitat will be protected. We just don't exactly know where within that nature outcome agreement area boundary those the final portfolio of protected areas will occur.
Bailey?
We're never going to change the fundamental cycle of financial reporting and of how we measure results, whether it's from a management perspective, an investor perspective. That's inherently short-term, quarter to quarter, year to year. I don't think we ever change that. What we do need to do is have a blended view as to how value is is generated, and recognizing that, to Dan's point, some of that is going to be long term. But I think when we look at how we structure nature outcome agreement areas, we need to have an element there that will provide that short-term return, or we're not going to get the investors coming to the party. So we're not going to change that nature, but we have to play to that in how we structure these agreements and these arrangements. And I think we also have to have a multi-year lens on how we view performance and outcomes.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think often in conservation, we go a long time without maybe talking to all of the people that we should. So, maybe aligning conservation with financial reporting cycles actually kind of encourages that collaboration in those discussions that support iterative planning, that support adaptive management, and maybe most importantly, support relationship building that we need to effectively protect these places.
A question from an amazing colleague from Zurich School of Business, Professor Olaf Weber. They said, this is a kind of great conversation. However, and that's, I think Olaf is reading my brain, because we're going to get this natural asset in the balance sheet, then the so what? However, the financialization of natural asset or food has been criticized because it opened up to speculation. How can we clarify that natural assets valuation is different?
It's a fantastic question, Olaf, and I think a critic's view on this would be that by trying to even put a value on natural assets and putting them on our balance sheets, whether it's government or private sector, we are in effect devaluing and underrepresenting.
Mm-hmm.
The view I take has always been different. It's always been that we need to give natural assets a voice in economic decision making, and by not financializing, by not recognizing and valuing these assets, they are in effect valued at zero in our economic decision making. And we've got to change that. We have to recognize that there is a very a real value. There's a true opportunity cost, and we can look at countless examples where that's the case. Where I think we do need more work, as I mentioned on the previous question, it's aligning the valuation methodologies and frameworks with our accounting and GAAP models. Those, as you all know, are very much historic cost based. Historic cost isn't going to work for natural assets valuation. So we need to have a lens to, okay, what can accountants, auditors, bankers make sense of on the balance sheet, and what can we live with, and what can we audit and verify, but also what might be more useful disclosures. And we've worked through all these conversations in other ways and means on things like complex financial instruments. And we've collectively gotten comfortable with how that's being reported and disclosed. So I think we just need to get our frameworks aligned with our accounting realities and recognize what belongs in the financial statements, what belongs in notes or other disclosures. But ultimately, let's get the information out there. Right now, it's not out there. We got to get it out there.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. Most Canadians value nature for intrinsic value, right? Which, I don't know if you can put a value on that, Bailey, or not. But right now, as Bailey said, I mean, we don't have nature on our ledger books, and because of that, it's left out of decision making. And I suspect that whatever value we assign to nature, it will always not be enough. But at least it gets nature into the forefront, and at least it helps people to understand the the value of nature beyond intrinsic value as well.
Yep.
Next question. Okay, this is from one of the co-applicant on our Natural Capital Valuation Hub SHIRK proposal. How does KPMG partnership with Natural Capital Hub help advance practical approaches to natural asset valuation and reporting? And what do you see as the key win for both practitioner and policymakers?
The emphasis here to me is very much that practicality of bringing a lens of both KPMG's global expertise in natural assets and measuring and valuing nature, and marrying that up with the academic research and the work that many of you are doing in terms of how we are viewing and approaching natural asset valuation. It needs to be very much a combination of practice and theory, and I think that is the greatest win for everybody here, because certainly we can look at how different methodologies have been employed and been used, but in how we build that into emerging practice, it needs to really make it real, and that's my hope with our partnership with the Natural Capital Hub, that we can make the ideas real. We can test these in the laboratory of practice with our clients around the world and bring those ideas back. I think that's where there's enormous value and opportunity.
So I have a question for Daniel. How can nature outcome agreement areas help better align ecological priority with real world financing and policy decisions?
Mm-hmm. They certainly provide an opportunity to identify important places, either for biodiversity or for cultural values. They bring people to the table who may not be at the table unless they're arguing about a specific project, which I think is critical. And I think they do provide an opportunity to maybe revisit some of our policies and plans to see if there are ways that they can be used to enable conservation and not act as a barrier.
There is another question I saw in the chat, the private chat here. So great talk, Daniel. Based on your experience across science, policy, and practice, what makes a conservation approach truly actionable and scalable in today's context?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple factors I think that are transforming the way we do conservation, and when we look back 10 years or 100 years from now, we'll say these were turning points in terms of mainstreaming biodiversity conservation in Canada and around the world. The first one, by far, and Canada's leading in this, is Indigenous-led conservation. It changes not only how we do conservation, but why we do conservation, which is critical. And that's part of the reasons why I see nature outcome agreement areas is so important, is because they can enable Indigenous-led conservation. The other one is around linking nature to health. And there's many initiatives, and this relates to valuing nature as well, but just the number of studies that are coming out just showing the importance of access to nature and being in nature to our physical and mental health is critical. And the third one is natural capital and incorporating nature into our financial systems and our financial thinking. I think for so long, conservation has just kind of been what non-governmental organizations do and what wildlife departments do. But we are seeing this transformation of where there's just more and more sectors that are engaged in conservation. In my work in the NGO world, I saw this amazing shift from companies, originally just wanting to write a check for conservation and seeing their name recognized in the annual report. Then they were coming and wanting to get involved in a project, plant trees or something like that. But the last few years, companies are coming forward with innovative and transformational approaches that they want help in implementing. So they're not just following, they're actually leading now, which I really see as something that's going to change conservation when it's and everyone's engaged.
Amazing. There is this one last question, promise. Okay, no problem, Don. How this is for both of you. How can frameworks like TNFD help move natural asset reporting from really an accounting issue to a real financial impact, or to real financial impact?
This is very, very timely, especially right now. As we're speaking, the ISSB, the National Sustainability Standards Board, is debating on the issuance of a practice guideline around nature and biodiversity, and how that is being incorporated in to the standards. So this is right on the mark. See, the thing that if we think about the parallel with Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosures and what it did for the E side of ESG, it really brought a lot more rigor and focus on the underlying data and what is underpinning the measurement of greenhouse gas emissions. And it led organizations to be much more disciplined in developing out their methodologies and getting more audible, verifiable data. So the overall data quality improved. And if you think about, again, even going to another parallel of financial statements as a whole, the way companies around the world got better at financial reporting was they've just been doing it, and they've been preparing financial statements and putting quarterly and annual statements out there for years. And that builds your reporting muscle and acumen and skill. So I think now, as we look at nature, TNFD is going to do that for nature by building that rigor, building those processes. And as data gets better, reporting gets better, and investment opportunities increase. And it's a win-win for everybody.
There is a question by Roy Brook from Natural Asset Initiative, one of our solid industry partner and thought leader in the area of natural asset. Roy, you want to join and ask your question, or we just ask it? Okay, so the question is there an example of nature outcome agreement area that you would hold us up? Yeah, Roy, go ahead.
Sorry, I've had some internet connectivity problems. I was just wondering, Daniel, first of all, thank you. Terrific discussion. And Samir, thank you so much for hosting this. I'm just wondering if there is a particular nature outcome agreement area that you would share as especially inspiring or interesting as a model of this kind of more collaborative and integrative decision making.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you ask me in 5 years, we'll hopefully have a different answer. This approach is emerging, and we are still working on it. But in developing it, we did look at where there seems to be land use planning approaches that are getting better outcomes for nature and for people. I'll just give you 2 quick examples. I mean, one of them, caribou range planning in Saskatchewan. They use these threshold-based models, so identifying that 65% of the landscape will be kept in intact habitat for boreal woodland caribou. Not mapping where that 65% is, but that's the goal, and industry, First Nations, and governments are working towards that. So that kind of removes the barriers of saying, nature's here, development's here, and here's sort of the lines, allows kind of this shifting and iterative planning. Many of the projects for conservation finance permanence are developing more of like these iterative plans. One of the best examples that we used for the report was the Great Bear Rainforest, where that's a great example of where you actually have zones which are called conservation, tourism, and mining. And those recognize that although the main purpose is conservation, that door is open a little bit for some type of limited future development within there. And that seems to be working quite effectively and got over that confrontational barriers of what seemed like a zero-sum game for all parties into something that seems to be working for local communities and for biodiversity.
Thank you. Great examples.
I have a question for both speaker. So to wrap up, I'd like to ask each one of you a final thought. Bailey and Daniel, if there is one key takeaway you would like our audience or the viewer of the recording would like you to leave with today, one idea or action that can help move natural capital valuation forward in practice, what would that be in 1 minute?
This is like a game show.
Yes,
I in my mind, Samir, it all comes down to we have to just get moving and put this into practice. We've debated, we've discussed the merits of natural asset valuation and recognition for a long time, and now what we need to do, I believe, is prove it can work. We need to prove it to ourselves. We need to prove it to the NGOs. We need to prove it to government, and we need to prove it to investors. And I think when we prove it can work, and I know it can work, once we demonstrate that with a couple project successes, then we can build scale. But we're not going to ever build the scale if we don't start putting one foot before the other and start with a few pilots and demonstrate success. So we have to get, I think, the first few nature outcome agreement areas defined and working, start small and start demonstrating this success.
Dan?
Yeah, I mean, we know we need to do things differently, both from a conservation perspective and from an economic perspective. And I agree with Bailey that we can talk about this and conceptualize it all we want, but we're really going to learn by doing. And we shouldn't be afraid to experiment, and we shouldn't be afraid to fail, because we're going to learn from that. And also the consequences of failing pale in comparison to the consequences of not trying. So I think that, we can work together and find these solutions. They're waiting for us. I think that having conversations like this across groups and folks that don't normally talk to each other is that's where the solutions to these complex problems lie.
In fact, honestly, to combine both what you said, this is actually and exactly what Natural Capital Valuation Hub community of practice, along with, like, we are bridging the gap between various scholars from Canada and from US and globally, with great industry partners like KPMG, like the Nature Asset Initiative, really to contribute to this debate and to kind of work out solutions. Of course, the solution might not be perfect, but at least we have something that we can work on and refine on future edition. It has been really an amazing session. Thank you all for being with us today. And before we close, I really want to take a moment to thank our speaker once again for really sharing their insights and helping us advance this important conversation on natural capital valuation and its critical role in shaping more sustainable financial and policy decisions. I'd also to thank you all, our participant. Too bad we could not accommodate all of you through this system, so you have to watch us live on LinkedIn or on YouTube. I really want to thank you for your engagement and contribution to growing our community of practice. And this community of practice is committed to bridging research, practice, and policy in this space, research that really have a social impact, an impact on our community, on Canada, and beyond. As a next step, Natural Capital Hub Valuation is very pleased to invite you to continue this conversation. We have an upcoming event. It's a Natural Capital Asset Valuation Workshop. It will be on April 23rd from 1 to 6, along with my wonderful colleague, Olaf Weber from Schulich University, Peter Van Dijk, who is a co-director for our Natural Capital Valuation Hub, who will be hosting a half-day workshop in Toronto with a virtual participation option available. And the workshop is really organized in collaboration with the Center of Excellence in Responsible Business, our Natural Capital Valuation Hub, and the Institute of Sustainable Finance, and it's supported by KPMG Canada. And the objective of this workshop is to bring together researchers, government, NGO, and industry leaders to continue this debate. We'll be very honored to welcome the Honorable Nathalie Provost, Secretary of State, Nature, who will share the government's vision on enhancing natural asset and strengthening private sector engagement in conservation. Of course, if you are interested in participating either in person or virtually, or potentially contributing a short presentation, we encourage you to reach either to me or to Olaf or to Peter, and we'll definitely share the link with you. We hope to see many of you in our incoming dialogue series live on LinkedIn and YouTube. Thank you all again, and you have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you.